Imagine the heart of Christianity suddenly uprooted from Rome, the eternal city, and transplanted to a small fortress town in southern France. In 1309, Pope Clement V made a decision that would send shockwaves through the medieval world. He moved the seat of the papacy to Avignon. What seemed like a simple relocation was anything but. For 68 years, Avignon became the stage for one of the most enigmatic chapters in church history, a period dripping with political machinations, shadowy alliances, and whispers of corruption that still echo today. Why would the Pope abandon Rome, who truly held the reins of power behind the scenes, and what hidden agendas transformed this quiet town into the epicenter of a spiritual and political storm? This wasn't just a change of address, it was a power play wrapped in velvet and secrecy. The Avignon Papacy, as it came to be known, was a time when faith and finance collided, when holy men wielded influence like kings, and when the very soul of the church seemed up for grabs. Behind the grand ceremonies and pious proclamations lay a web of intrigue. French monarchs pulling strings from the shadows, vast fortunes amassed through dubious means, and accusations of heresy that threatened to tear Christendom apart. Some called it a captivity, others a calculated maneuver. But one thing was certain, nothing about Avignon was as it appeared. Today, we're peeling back the layers of this medieval mystery to uncover the truth behind the Avignon Papacy. What drove these men of God to act like princes? How did a sleepy town on the Rhone River become the battleground for Europe's most powerful figures? And why, even centuries later, do historians still debate whether this was a betrayal of faith or a masterstroke of survival? From whispered conspiracies to bold power grabs, this is the story of how religion, politics, and ambition twisted together into a saga that would change the course of history. Strap in, we're diving deep into the shadows of the 14th century, where every stone in Avignon's papal palace has a secret to tell. To understand why the papacy abandoned Rome, we need to rewind to the turbulent early 1400s, a time when church and crown were locked in a bitter dance for power. King Philip IV of France, nicknamed the Fair for his looks but not his tactics, had been tightening his grip on the church for years. His boldest move: destroying the Knights Templar, the wealthy warrior monks whose vast treasure and influence made them a threat. When Pope Clement V, a former French bishop, took the throne in 1305, Philip saw his chance. The new pope was in a precarious position, crowned in Lyon under French military escort, his authority questioned by Italian cardinals who resented French dominance. Then came the Templar affair. In 1307, Philip launched a stunning crackdown, arresting hundreds of Templars on trumped-up charges of heresy and sacrilege. Clement initially resisted, but under relentless pressure, some say blackmail, he eventually disbanded the order, handing its riches to Philip. The message was clear: even the Pope couldn't defy the French king. With Rome engulfed in violent factional wars and his own safety uncertain, Clement made a fateful choice in 1309. He moved the papal court to Avignon, a small but strategically vital town just inside French territory. Officially, it was a temporary measure for stability. In reality, it placed the Vatican squarely in Philip's shadow. Avignon wasn't just a retreat, it became a fortress of papal power, literally. Clement's successors expanded the modest bishop's palace into a sprawling Gothic stronghold with towering walls, secret chambers, and even its own treasury. The popes ruled like monarchs here, surrounded by French cardinals and lavish French-style courts. Critics called it the Babylonian captivity, claiming the papacy had become a puppet of France. But others argue it was a survival tactic, a way to shield the church from Rome's chaos while keeping some independence. Either way, one thing was undeniable. For nearly 7 decades, the fate of Christianity hinged on this unlikely riverside town and the men who turned it into the ultimate power base. Rising from the banks of the Rhone like a stone declaration of power, the Palais des Papes wasn't just a residence, it was a statement. By the time Pope Benedict XII ordered its expansion in 1334, this fortress of faith had already begun to dwarf every other building in Avignon. Imagine a structure so vast it consumed nearly 3 acres, with walls 30 feet thick in places, designed to withstand sieges both military and political. But the genius of this palace wasn't just in its brute strength. It was in the way every archway, every fresco, every hidden passage whispered dual messages: divine authority to the faithful and unshakable dominance to rival kings. Walk through its corridors even today, and you'll feel the calculated theater of power. The grand chapel's vaulted ceilings drew eyes heavenward during Mass, while just below, a warren of administrative offices hummed with scribes tallying tithes from across Europe. Upstairs, the Pope's private chambers featured lavish frescoes of hunting scenes, a nod to French royal tastes that scandalized clerics who expected biblical imagery. And then there were the secrets, staircases leading to nowhere, hollow walls perfect for overhearing conversations, and a treasury accessible only through a disguised door in the papal bedroom. This wasn't just architecture, it was psychological warfare in limestone. The palace's very layout revealed the Avignon Papacy's tightrope walk between independence and subservience. While its southern wing faced Rome in symbolic defiance, the northern towers overlooked French territory, a daily reminder of where real influence lay. French masons and architects shaped its Gothic silhouette, embedding fleurs de lis discreetly among the crosses. Even the famed consistory hall, where cardinals gathered, had acoustics engineered so the Pope's voice would carry unnaturally far, amplifying his authority while French ambassadors observed from strategically placed galleries. Every stone seemed to ask, was this the seat of Christ's vicar or a satellite court for the French crown? Yet for all its political cunning, the palace also became an unexpected beacon of culture. Its library held thousands of manuscripts, attracting scholars who mingled with bankers and diplomats in its courtyards. The famed Avignon workshops produced illuminated manuscripts that blended Italian artistry with French opulence, while musicians from across Europe competed to perform in its halls. This collision of sacred and secular created a paradox, a papal court that felt more like a royal capital, where theological debates unfolded alongside whispered trade deals. The palace didn't just house the papacy, it redefined what the papacy could be. What makes Avignon's papal palace truly extraordinary is how it mirrors the era's contradictions. Those towering walls, they protected not just against invaders, but from prying eyes as financial reforms centralized church wealth. The breathtaking chapel of St. Martial covered in golden frescoes. Built by a pope accused of simony, even the famed broken bridge of Avignon, immortalized in song, became a metaphor, a span that reached toward Rome but stopped abruptly mid-river, forever caught between two worlds. For 68 years, this architectural marvel stood as both sanctuary and gilded cage, its stones bearing witness to piety and pragmatism in equal measure. Money didn't just flow through Avignon, it pooled there, swirling around the papal court in a golden tide that reshaped Christendom. The popes of this era didn't just inherit spiritual authority, they built an economic machine so sophisticated it would make modern bankers pause. Take annats, for example, a clever invention that required every newly appointed bishop or abbot to hand over their first full year's income to the papal treasury. On the surface, it funded church operations, but critics saw it for what it really was, a spiritual shakedown, turning sacred offices into revenue streams. And that was just the beginning. Resentment simmered as the Avignon bureaucracy ballooned into a labyrinth of tax collectors, notaries, and legates, all demanding their cut. The Camera Apostolica, the papal financial office, became a shadow government, issuing receipts for everything from marriage dispensations to pardons for sins. Even the dead weren't spared. Heirs had to pay hefty fees to claim inheritances tied to church lands. European monarchs fumed as silver and gold vanished into Avignon's coffers, with one chronicler griping that the Pope's mints devoured money like the frogs of Egypt. But the real scandal wasn't the taxation, it was the blatant blurring of sacred and profane. Simony, the ancient sin of selling spiritual favors, reached audacious new heights. Bishops' appointments went to the highest bidders, with whispered stories of cardinals' nephews miraculously qualifying for lucrative posts. Pope John XXII, a former financier, allegedly kept ledger books listing indulgences by price, cheaper for petty theft, steeper for murder. The papal court's lavish banquets and French-style opulence fueled outrage, especially in regions like Germany and England, where clergy began openly accusing Avignon of turning salvation into a transaction. Yet there's another side to this story. The Avignon popes argued their financial reforms brought order to a fractured system. By centralizing funds, they could bankroll crusades, build hospitals, and stabilize a church teetering on collapse. The bureaucratic machine, though bloated, standardized records for the first time, reducing local corruption. Even annates, however unpopular, funded everything from cathedral repairs to famine relief. But optics mattered, and as the papal palace glittered with French gold, the gap between the humble fishermen of Galilee and their successors grew impossible to ignore. The backlash was inevitable. In England, statutes were passed to block church funds from leaving the kingdom. In Italy, cities withheld payments, mocking Avignon as the Babylon of the West. Most damning of all were the reformers' figures like Catherine of Siena, who wrote scathing letters accusing the popes of shearing the sheep instead of tending them. This wasn't just about greed, it was about trust. When faith becomes a commodity, something sacred fractures. By the time Gregory XI finally returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, the treasury was full, but the church's moral account was dangerously overdrawn. The French crown didn't just influence the Avignon papacy, it wrapped around it like iron bands, squeezing until the boundaries between church and state blurred beyond recognition. Take the papal elections themselves. Of the 7 popes who ruled from Avignon, all were French, and 6 had direct ties to the French royal court before their elevation. This wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. King Philip IV set the template, handpicking Clement V, his former personal chaplain, as a compliant ally. But the real power move came in 1316, when Philip's deathbed ultimatum forced the cardinals to elect another Frenchman, John XXII, under threat of military intervention. The message was unmistakable. The conclave's divine inspiration now had a very earthly address. The Louvre, diplomatic cables from the era reveal a startling pattern. French ambassadors referred to Avignon not as a holy see, but as the king's other chancery. Papal bulls condemning French rivals like England's Edward III often bore uncanny resemblance to Paris' own foreign policy decrees. When the papacy needed to rally support for crusades, French cardinals mysteriously diverted funds to Philip VI's wars against Flanders. Even the infamous divorce case of Philip the Fair's daughter, Isabella, showed the mechanics of control. After the Pope initially refused to annul her marriage, French pressure miraculously produced a reversal within months. Yet the relationship wasn't purely one-sided. The Avignon popes were no puppets, they played a dangerous game of their own. Benedict XII, a former Cistercian monk, openly defied King Philip VI by refusing to canonize his grandfather, Philip the Fair, a stunning rebuke to royal sanctity. Clement VI, though French, secretly negotiated with the Holy Roman Emperor, using church funds as leverage against Paris, the papacy's greatest weapon. Its financial network, by controlling ecclesiastical appointments across Europe, Avignon could reward French loyalty or punish disobedience with bishoprics and benefices. What emerges isn't a simple tale of domination, but a toxic symbiosis. The French crown gained a holy stamp for its wars and taxes, while the popes acquired military protection and a streamlined bureaucracy. But the cost was steep. When Petrarch visited Avignon in the 1340s, he famously spat venom at the Babylon where gold was god, and French knights lounged in cardinals' chambers. The scandal reached its peak under Urban V, whose attempted return to Rome in 1367 was sabotaged by French cardinals. Some historians claim they threatened to elect an anti-pope. In the shadows of the Palais des Papes, two systems of power had become irreversibly entangled. French queens whispered to papal nephews, while Italian bankers bribed French ministers for access to church contracts. The Avignon Papacy didn't just serve France, it became a mirror to its ambitions, reflecting a world where spiritual authority could be weaponized, where a king's whisper might echo louder than scripture. When Gregory XI finally broke the spell and returned to Rome in 1377, he didn't just leave behind a palace, he fled a system that had blurred the divine and the political beyond repair. Petrarch didn't mince words when he first set eyes on Avignon's papal court. The poet and scholar, revered as one of Rome's staunchest defenders, took one look at the gilded halls and French cardinals and spat out the phrase that would haunt the papacy for centuries: the Babylonian captivity. It was a deliberate, devastating comparison. Just as the ancient Hebrews had been dragged from Jerusalem to Babylon in chains, so too, he argued, had the true church been wrenched from its sacred home and held hostage by French kings. But was this fiery metaphor accurate, or was Petrarch crafting propaganda for an Italy desperate to reclaim its stolen spiritual crown? The parallels seemed damning at first glance. Like the biblical exiles, the Avignon popes lived in splendor far from their homeland, surrounded by foreign influence. The lavish courts, the French-speaking clergy, the royal interference, all fed the narrative of a papacy held captive. German clerics grumbled about the French pope's leash, while Italian preachers thundered that the whore of Babylon from Revelation now wore a fleur-de-lis. Even the architecture played into the myth. The Palais des Papes, with its fortress-like walls, looked less like a holy sanctuary and more like a prison for the soul of Christendom. But peel back the layers and the captivity narrative starts to fray. The Avignon popes weren't powerless prisoners. They were shrewd operators who leveraged their French ties to unprecedented effect. Unlike the biblical exiles who yearned for Jerusalem, many of these pontiffs showed little urgency to return. Clement VI even turned down a solemn delegation from Rome begging him to come back, claiming the city was too unstable. This wasn't a hostage situation, it was a calculated partnership. France provided military protection and administrative muscle, while the papacy gained stability and a streamlined financial system. The real scandal wasn't captivity, it was how willingly some popes embraced their gilded exile. The financial angle reveals even more cracks in Petrarch's framing. Babylonian captives didn't amass fortunes, yet the Avignon treasury overflowed. Records show popes actively investing in banks, manipulating currency exchange rates, and even funding international trade deals, hardly the acts of powerless captives. When Pope John XXII died, his personal wealth stunned Europe. Crowns jeweled with sapphires, tapestries woven with gold thread, and a private library that rivaled royal collections. This wasn't loot pillaged by French kings, it was wealth accumulated through a church operating at peak efficiency. Perhaps the most telling counterpoint lies in the papacy's global reach during these decades. Far from being constrained, Avignon's popes launched crusades, negotiated peace treaties between warring kingdoms, and expanded missionary work into Asia. The papal court became a diplomatic hub where ambassadors from Aragon to Poland jockeyed for influence, activities impossible for a truly captive institution. Even the controversial reservation system, where popes claimed the right to appoint bishops across Europe, demonstrates expansive ambition, not subjugation. So why did the captivity myth stick? Partly because it served powerful interests. Italian city-states bleeding revenue without papal pilgrims fueled the narrative. Reformers like Catherine of Siena weaponized it to shame popes into returning, and for ordinary believers, the idea of a corrupted, exiled church resonated with apocalyptic fears simmering since the Black Death. The truth, as always, was messier, a dance of mutual exploitation where French kings and popes each gained something, even as the spiritual cost mounted. By the time Gregory XI finally heeded the calls to return to Rome, the legacy was set. Avignon would forever be remembered not as a strategic stronghold, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when faith and power share the same bed. Clement VI didn't just bring the papacy to Avignon, he brought his family. When this charismatic, luxury-loving pope took the throne in 1342, he didn't hide his intentions. Within months, his nephew Hugues Roger became a cardinal at the tender age of 19, despite having barely begun his theological studies. Another nephew, Pierre Roger de Beaufort, would later become Pope Gregory XI, handed the keys to Christendom by his uncle's carefully stacked college of cardinals. This wasn't just favoritism, it was dynasty building in the guise of divine appointment, and it turned the papal court into a family business. The scale of Clement's nepotism would make even Renaissance princes blush. Official records show he appointed at least 5 close relatives as cardinals, gifted over 20 plush bishoprics to cousins, and installed his brother as Archbishop of Rouen, one of France's richest sees. But the real scandal lay in the titles that didn't appear on paper. His niece's husband became the papal treasurer, controlling the flow of church gold. A distant cousin monopolized contracts for supplying the palace's lavish banquets. Even the master of papal ceremonies turned out to be Clement's childhood friend from Limoges, whose main qualification seemed to be knowing which wine the pontiff preferred. What made this nepotism so corrosive wasn't just the blatant self-dealing, it was how it warped the church's spiritual mission. When bishops owed their positions to blood rather than piety, their priorities shifted. The Diocese of Therouanne, handed to Clement's teenage grandnephew, became notorious for absentee leadership as its boy bishop toured French tournaments instead of tending his flock. Meanwhile, competent clerics found their careers frozen unless they married into the papal family business. A surviving letter from an Italian bishop complains that promotion now required proof of kinship, not competence, reducing holy offices to hereditary trinkets. The financial toll was staggering. Clement's relatives drew salaries equivalent to minor kings. His nephew, the cardinal, received an annual stipend that could feed 10,000 peasants for a year. But the deeper damage was to the church's moral authority. When drought struck Provence in 1346, starving crowds gathered outside Avignon's walls, watching as papal nephews hosted jousting tournaments with horses draped in silk. The disconnect between Christ's teachings and the papal court's excess fueled outrage. Mystics like Birgitta of Sweden wrote searing visions of St. Peter weeping as his keys were traded like market goods. Yet there's a twist to this tale of nepotism. Some historians argue Clement's appointments weren't just about greed, they reflected a brutal pragmatism. In an era where assassination plots against popes were common, surrounding oneself with loyal family created a human shield. His nephew cardinals reportedly slept armed outside his chambers after poison rumors surfaced. And while his relatives enriched themselves, they also formed a disciplined faction that could outmaneuver French royal interference. The bitter irony. The very nepotism that corrupted the church's image may have preserved its political independence during Avignon's most precarious years. By the time Clement died in 1352, the damage was irreversible. The term nepotism, itself from the Italian nepote, meaning nephew, would later crystallize around Avignon's excesses. More immediately, it set a precedent. His successor, Innocent VI, faced revolts from cardinals demanding their own relatives be promoted. The great schism that eventually split Christendom had roots in this toxic culture of entitlement. What began as one pope's family strategy became a slow poison, eroding faith not just in individual leaders, but in the very idea that spiritual authority could transcend earthly corruption. The stench of nepotism clung to Avignon long after the popes returned to Rome, a reminder that even God's representatives aren't immune to the temptations of dynasty. When the Black Death seeped into Europe's ports in 1347, it didn't just bring disease, it unleashed a tidal wave of terror and theological panic. As corpses piled up in streets from Marseille to London, a desperate question gripped Christendom. Why was God allowing such suffering? The answer for many lay in the glittering towers of Avignon. Preachers across the continent pointed to the papal court's opulence as the ultimate provocation, a betrayal of Christian humility so grotesque that divine wrath was inevitable. The plague became more than a biological catastrophe. It transformed into a moral indictment of the Avignon Papacy's excesses. Fire and brimstone sermons painted the plague as heaven's reckoning. The Franciscan friar Jean de Roquetelade, who walked among the dying in southern France, declared Avignon a second Sodom, its papal palace a den of thieves whose gold has poisoned the air. In Germany, flagellant processions snaked through plague-stricken towns, their bloodied backs a protest against church corruption. Even the papal court's own chronicler, the usually discreet Jean Froissart, recorded chilling whispers among servants that the stench of rotting purses in the treasury had summoned the pestilence. The symbolism was potent. As commoners perished in filth, Pope Clement VI, who purchased over 1,000 rare spices to ward off miasmas, held fragrant balls of ambergris to his nose. The backlash turned shockingly visceral. In Paris, mobs sacked properties owned by papal tax collectors, shouting that the fleas of the poor would now feast on church wealth. Italian artists drew grotesque caricatures of cardinals with bloated bellies riding skeletal horses labeled death's collectors. Most damning were the miracle tales spreading among peasant stories of golden crucifixes melting in priests' hands during Mass or of communion wine turning black mid-sip. These weren't just folk superstitions, they reflected a profound rupture in trust. When the institution meant to intercede with God prioritized self-preservation over pastoral care, ordinary believers reinterpreted catastrophe through the lens of betrayal. Yet the Avignon Pope's response only deepened the crisis. Clement VI's much-publicized decision to consecrate the Rhone River as a mass burial site, allowing plague victims to bypass normal funeral rites, was framed as mercy, but many saw a cold calculation. With clergy dying faster than they could be replaced, the Church streamlined salvation itself. Indulgences, once carefully regulated, were now sold in bulk to terrified crowds. Records show one Breton merchant purchasing pardons for 37 fictional sins, fearing the plague would strike before he could confess. The sacred had become a commodity and the market was booming. Archaeology offers haunting evidence of this spiritual reckoning. In excavation sites near Avignon, mass graves from the plague years reveal corpses buried with crude lead scrolls, defiant messages to the papacy etched by the dying. One reads, "You who dine above our graves, know that your feasts choke you." Another bears a simple sketch of a reversed crucifix, its crossbeam weighted with coins. These artifacts capture a moment when faith curdled into fury, when the distance between marble floors in the papal palace and dirt floors in peasant huts became an unbridgeable chasm of resentment. The Black Death's aftermath forced uncomfortable truths into the light. While the papal treasury grew fat on emergency tithes, entire monastic orders vanished. When the dust settled, a third of Europe's clergy were dead, leaving survivors to grapple with the dissonance between divine promises and earthly suffering. The Avignon Papacy's failure to embody sacrificial leadership during civilization's darkest hour didn't just damage its reputation. It seeded doubts that would later fuel reformers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. In the end, the plague's legacy wasn't just demographic collapse. It was the unmasking of a spiritual crisis, one where the shepherds had grown too comfortable to smell the rot in their own flock. When the first arrows of the Hundred Years' War flew across the Channel in 1337, the Avignon Papacy didn't just watch from the sidelines, it became a shadow player in the conflict, wielding spiritual authority as a political weapon. Officially, the popes positioned themselves as neutral peacemakers, sending cardinals to broker truces between England's Edward III and France's Philip VI. But secret correspondence tells a different story. Coded letters from Avignon's archives reveal how papal legates subtly funneled intelligence to French commanders, while publicly scolding both sides for their unchristian warmongering. This wasn't diplomacy, it was high-stakes theater, with the papal court playing both referee and covert ally. Take the failed peace mission of 1343. Pope Clement VI dispatched the aristocratic Cardinal Anibaldo di Saccano to negotiate a ceasefire, but French chronicles later uncovered that his real mandate was to stall, giving Philip time to regroup after the disastrous Battle of Sluys. Di Saccano's lavish banquets for English envoys, complete with Avignon's finest wines, weren't hospitality, they were delayed tactics. Meanwhile, French bishops secretly diverted church tithes from Normandy to fund Philip's army, all with whispered approval from papal accountants. When Edward III finally realized the ruse, he stormed out of talks, reportedly snarling that the Pope's white robes hid a heart-dyed French blue. The bias wasn't just political, it was financial. Church records show Avignon quietly granted France the right to tax clergy for war expenses, and privilege denied to England under the thin pretext of canonical irregularities. Worse still, when English bishops protested, their appeals vanished into bureaucratic limbo. One particularly brazen move came in 1356, when Innocent VI's nephew, the Cardinal of Périgord, brokered the Treaty of Bordeaux, a document that miraculously required England to surrender key territories while letting France keep disputed lands under holy protection. Edward's negotiators called it scripture rewritten by Parisian scribes, yet the Avignon popes weren't mere puppets, they played both sides when it suited them. During a lull in fighting, Urban V covertly promised Edward's envoys that England might receive a cardinal's hat if they eased hostilities. The offer wasn't about peace, it was about rebalancing power. Urban knew too much French dominance would make the papacy irrelevant, but these maneuvers carried a cost. By 1375, English parishes openly defied Avignon's authority, with one York preacher declaring, "We'll send our pennies to Rome when Rome stops buying French swords." The papacy's greatest miscalculation lay in underestimating how its partisan role would backfire. French victories were celebrated in Avignon with Te Deums, while English defeats went unmentioned. When the tide turned after Poitiers in 1356, with France's king captured and humiliated, the papal court scrambled to rebrand its neutrality. Suddenly, sermons emphasized the brotherhood of all Christian princes, but the damage was done. The war didn't just weaken monarchies, it exposed the papacy as another power-hungry faction, trading spiritual capital for earthly influence. By the time Gregory XI returned to Rome, the Avignon popes had left behind more than a palace, they'd cemented a legacy where the cross and the fleur-de-lis became indistinguishable. The death of Pope Benedict XI in 1304 wasn't just tragic, it was suspiciously convenient. After reigning a mere 8 months, the pontiff collapsed in Perugia, his body racked with agonizing cramps. Within days, he was dead at age 53, and rumors exploded like wildfire. Witnesses reported blackened fingertips, a swollen tongue, and a sudden putrid stench, all classic signs of medieval poison. But the real shock came when his physicians vanished overnight and his personal journals were burned by unknown hands. Benedict had been cleaning house in the Vatican, cracking down on corrupt cardinals and defying French King Philip IV's demands. His sudden demise cleared the path for Clement V, the pliable French bishop who'd eventually move the papacy to Avignon. Coincidence? Few at the time believed it. Digging deeper reveals a web of motives. Benedict had been investigating the outrageous actions of Philip's minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, the same man who'd famously slapped Pope Boniface VIII during a kidnapping attempt. By stripping Nogaret of his titles and threatening excommunication, Benedict made powerful enemies. Even more telling, the conclave to elect his successor dragged on 11 months, with French cardinals blocking every Italian candidate until Clement emerged. A surviving letter from a Bolognese merchant describes a French envoy boasting that the Holy See would soon learn the price of defiance. Whether poison came from a royal kitchen or a cardinal's vial remains unknown, but the message was clear: crossing France could be deadly. Benedict wasn't the only casualty in Avignon's shadow war. Cardinal Napoleon Orsini, a fierce critic of French influence, succumbed to a sudden fever in 1332, just days after dining with a pro-French faction. His private chaplain later swore under oath that Orsini gasped about bitter wine before dying. Then came the bizarre case of Bishop Pierre de Castelnau, who accused Avignon's papal treasurer of embezzlement in 1351. Castelnau was found slumped over his ledger books, a half-drunk cup of mulled wine beside him. The official verdict: apoplexy. The treasury's records were lost the next week. Even natural deaths fueled conspiracies. When the brilliant reformer Cardinal Bertrand de Daux died in his sleep in 1362, reformers pointed to his recent memo demanding an end to nepotism. His successor, the Pope's 20-year-old nephew. The Avignon era's mortality patterns read like a thriller: cardinals dropping dead before key votes, French rivals suffering hunting accidents, and at least 3 papal physicians fleeing in the night. Modern forensic analysis of Benedict XI's tomb suggests arsenic in his bones, but the truth remains buried under centuries of denials. What's undeniable is how fear seeped into the papal court stones, where every meal became a gamble and loyalty was the only insurance against a sudden, silent end. The suppression of the Knights Templar wasn't just a religious purge. It was one of history's greatest heists, orchestrated under the gilded ceilings of Avignon. When Pope Clement V bowed to King Philip IV's demands and dissolved the order in 1312, the official reason was heresy. But the whispers in royal courts and taverns told a different story. This was about money. The Templars weren't just warrior monks, they were Europe's first international bankers, with a financial network stretching from Jerusalem to London. Their vaults held fortunes in gold, land deeds, and promissory notes enough to make kings tremble with envy. And when Philip's agents arrested hundreds of Templars in a single dawn raid, the question wasn't just about guilt, it was about where all that wealth would go. Documents from the era reveal a shocking paper trail. While Templar Grandmaster Jacques de Molay burned at the stake, papal legates quietly inventoried the order's properties. On paper, these assets were transferred to the rival Knights Hospitaller, but dig deeper and the numbers don't add up. The Hospitaller's own records show only a fraction of expected Templar holdings ever reached them. So where did the rest vanish? Hidden clauses in Clement's decree granted the papacy temporary stewardship of certain assets, a loophole wide enough to drive a cartload of treasure through. Within months, Avignon's treasury swelled with mysterious deposits, including gold bullion stamped with Templar sigils that had supposedly been melted down. The French crown's fingerprints are everywhere. Philip's agents seized Templar strongholds like the Paris Temple, a fortress so secure it had served as France's royal bank. Witnesses later testified that wagons creaked through the gates for weeks, their contents never fully accounted for. Even more damning, Clement's sudden ability to fund massive construction projects in Avignon, including the first expansions of the Papal Palace. Where had a previously cash-strapped pope found such resources? Contemporary chroniclers like Geoffrey of Paris hinted at the answer, writing of gold that crept from one holy house to another under cover of darkness. Then there are the gaps in the record, deliberate erasures that reek of complicity. Templar financial ledgers from Cyprus and Provence disappear after 1312, while papal tax records from the same years show inexplicable spikes in revenue. Some of the most telling evidence comes from unexpected places, like the diary of a Florentine banker who recorded a suspicious inflow of Templar-marked coin into Avignon's papal mint. Even the fate of the Templars' fabled secret archives fuels speculation. Were they destroyed, hidden, or bargained away in closed-door deals between Philip's ministers and Clement's cardinals? The legacy of this great theft reshaped Europe's power structure. With the Templars gone, the papacy and French crown tightened their grip on international finance. Avignon became a clearinghouse for debt collection, using Templar account books to call in loans from nobles across Christendom. Meanwhile, Philip paid off his crushing war debts with seized Templar assets, even as Clement levied new church taxes to investigate heresy. The cynicism was breathtaking. The same institution that condemned the Templars for greed absorbed their wealth while pretending to purify it. Yet the story doesn't end there. Legends persist that not all the Templar treasure fell into official hands. From Swiss monasteries to Scottish castles, folktales tell of knights smuggling chests of relics and gold into hiding. Some historians speculate these escape routes were tacitly allowed, a way for certain cardinals or French nobles to skim riches off the top. The truth may never be fully known, but one thing is certain: the fall of the Templars didn't just enrich Avignon, it exposed how easily faith could become a fig leaf for theft. When de Maillet cursed his persecutors from the flames, he wasn't just damning individuals, he was foreseeing an era where the holy and the corrupt would share the same counting table. Fear spread faster than the Black Death itself when ragged processions of flagellants began marching through European towns, their bare backs crisscrossed with self-inflicted wounds. These zealots saw the Avignon Papacy not as a spiritual authority, but as the whore of Babylon from Revelation, perched upon the Rhone instead of the Tiber. Their chants carried eerie prophecies that Christ would return only after the papacy fled its gilded prison in Avignon and a holy pope reclaimed Rome. This wasn't just fringe fanaticism, it was a symptom of deeper anxieties gripping medieval Europe, where political corruption and apocalyptic dread twisted together into explosive movements. Among the most chilling was the prophecy of Jean de Roquetelade, a Franciscan mystic imprisoned in Avignon's papal dungeons. From his cell, he penned visions of an angelic pope who would abandon Avignon, triggering earthquakes and plagues that would cleanse the church of its French captivity. His writings spread like wildfire, copied secretly by monks and read aloud in taverns. Even educated clerics took notice when his prediction of a great Western schism, where rival popes would tear Christendom apart, began unfolding decades later. The Avignon Papacy's legitimacy wasn't just questioned, it became a cosmic battleground between divine will and earthly corruption, nor were the flagellants alone in their fury. In Germany, the secretive Friends of God movement taught that Avignon's popes were false shepherds, pointing to biblical passages about shepherds who flee when wolves approach. Their leader, the mystic Heinrich von Nördlingen, claimed the true church now existed only in small, persecuted communities, not in palaces where cardinals wore robes heavy with the blood of the poor. When the Black Death struck, these groups saw it as divine confirmation, interpreting the plague spread from Marseille just downstream from Avignon as God's judgment starting at the corrupt heart. The most politically explosive prophecy came from the enigmatic Telesphorus of Cosenza. His forged manuscript, circulated in the 1360s, described 3 captive popes who would rule from foreign soil before a final reckoning. Cleverly crafted to match Avignon's 7th pope, Gregory XI, it warned that his return to Rome would unleash the Antichrist. French cardinals seized on this to pressure Gregory into staying, while Italian reformers brandished it as proof Avignon's era must end. Prophecy had become a weapon wielded by both sides in a battle for the soul of Christianity. Yet beneath the hysteria lay a sobering truth. These movements thrived because Avignon's excesses had shattered medieval trust in institutional holiness. When flagellants whipped themselves raw begging for mercy, or when peasants starved while papal tax collectors built marble chapels, faith curdled into desperation. The papacy's greatest failure wasn't financial or political, it was spiritual. By the time Catherine of Siena warned Gregory XI that God's anger cannot be restrained much longer, the return to Rome wasn't just a logistical decision, it was a race against the clock of divine wrath ticking in the hearts of believers. The Avignon popes wrapped themselves in robes of divine mandate, insisting their authority descended directly from St. Peter, whether exercised from Rome or the banks of the Rhone. Papal bulls thundered across Europe, demanding obedience under pain of excommunication, while theologians in their pay spun elaborate arguments. Didn't Christ promise the gates of hell wouldn't prevail against the Church, regardless of geography? Yet for all their bluster, a quiet revolution was brewing, one that would expose the hollowness of their claims. At its heart stood an unlikely figure, an uneducated Tuscan mystic named Catherine of Siena, whose letters to Pope Gregory XI read like spiritual lightning strikes. Catherine didn't just question Avignon's legitimacy, she dismantled it brick by brick. Her famous plea in 1376 cut to the core. You are in exile, not because the Florentines threaten you, but because you've exiled yourself from Christ's will. The symbolism was devastating. Rome wasn't just a city, it was the blood-stained soil where Peter and Paul had been martyred, the sacred ground that tethered the Church to its apostolic roots. By treating it as disposable, she argued the popes had severed their own spiritual lifeline. Her visions, shared with growing crowds, depicted Christ weeping over Avignon's papal palace, its gilded halls empty of true grace. The dissent wasn't confined to mystics. Oxford theologian John Wycliffe railed against the French captivity, arguing that Scripture gave no pope the right to rule from foreign soil. His incendiary pamphlets pointed to the Book of Revelation's great whore seated on many waters, a thinly veiled jab at Avignon's riverine splendor. Even within the Church, whispers grew louder. The German monk Heinrich of Langenstein penned a daring treatise suggesting general councils, not popes, should govern Christendom, a direct challenge to Avignon's absolutism. What made this backlash so potent was its grassroots spread. Illuminated manuscripts smuggled out of Italy showed St. Peter holding his keys upside down over Avignon, while popular street plays depicted French cardinals as foxes gnawing at the Church's foundations. In Spain, King Pedro, the cruel no-paragon of piety himself, openly mocked papal legates, asking whether they'd brought the keys to Philip's treasury, along with the keys to heaven. The Avignon Papacy wasn't just facing theological criticism, it was losing the battle for hearts and minds. Gregory XI's eventual return to Rome in 1377 wasn't purely spiritual. French mercenaries had to carve a path through rebel-held Italy. But the deeper truth lingered. A papacy that needed swords to reclaim its holy city had already conceded something profound. When Gregory died just a year later, the Great Schism erupted, proof that decades in Avignon had eroded something more vital than territory, the unshakable belief that where the Pope sat, there sat the Church. Centuries of unquestioned authority had been unmasked as contingent, negotiable, all too human. The palace on the Rhone still stands, but what crumbled in those final years was far more fragile. The illusion that power alone could sanctify a throne. Petrarch's pen dripped venom when describing Avignon's papal court, not as a beacon of piety, but as a sewer where all the filth of the universe collects. The poet wasn't exaggerating for effect. Behind the palace's soaring arches and jeweled altars unfolded scenes straight out of a decadent royal court, rather than the humble successors of St. Peter. Take Pope Clement VI's legendary coronation feast in 1342. 30 courses served on solid gold plates, featuring roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers, wine fountains flowing in the courtyards, and a final course of live birds released from pies to flutter over stunned guests. The bill could have fed an entire province for a year, and that was just day one of the celebrations. The excess didn't stop at banquets. Cardinals maintained stables of Arab stallions draped in silk, while their nephews, a convenient euphemism for illegitimate sons, gambled with gem-encrusted dice. One scandalized bishop wrote of finding a cardinal's chambers strewn with discarded love poems and women's slippers, the bed still warm though His Eminence had just left for morning prayers. Even the sacred became sensual. The same hands that consecrated the Eucharist commissioned erotic frescoes for private chambers, justifying them as reminders of earthly temptation to overcome. Chroniclers whispered of midnight masquerades where masked clerics danced with merchants' wives, their identities hidden but their vows forgotten. Petrarch reserved special outrage for the financial rot. In one blistering letter, he described watching a cardinal negotiate the price of a bishopric over roasted songbirds, haggling as if purchasing a mule. The going rate for archbishoprics reportedly reached 30,000 gold florins, roughly the annual income of a mid-sized kingdom. Meanwhile, papal tax collectors employed creative accounting. One Florentine banker's diary noted a sin tax levied on a widow remarrying, with the collector pocketing half and sending the rest to Avignon marked as charity for the poor. No wonder the poet dubbed the palace Christ's marketplace, where sacraments sold by the ounce and salvation came with interest, yet the most damning accusations involved the papal inner circle itself. When Clement VI's mistress, the beautiful Cecile de Comminges, began appearing at state functions draped in silks paid for by church coffers, even French nobles balked. Her brother suddenly became Bishop of Toulouse despite being illiterate, sparking protests that forced the Pope to stage a farcical exam, where the young man allegedly passed by reciting the Lord's Prayer after 3 attempts. Later popes grew subtler but no less nepotistic. Innocent VI's chamberlain was rumored to be his illegitimate son, given control of the palace guard and keys to the treasury. The contrast with Christ's teachings couldn't have been starker. While gospel parables spoke of camels passing through needles' eyes easier than rich men entering heaven, Avignon's elite wore robes stiff with gold thread. Franciscan friars who preached poverty were barred from the city walls, while moneylenders enjoyed front-row seats at papal masses. Small wonder reformist movements like the spiritual Franciscans declared Avignon the whore of Babylon from Revelation, a corrupt institution drunk on power and blind to its own hypocrisy. Archaeologists digging beneath the palace floors recently uncovered a sobering artifact, a child's doll, finely crafted with movable limbs and dressed in miniature cardinal's robes. Was it a noble girl's toy or evidence of the children who grew up in the palace's shadows, their parentage winked at but never acknowledged? The Avignon Papacy's true scandal wasn't just the feasts or the mistresses, it was the normalization of excess, the way spiritual office became inseparable from earthly privilege. When Gregory XI finally left for Rome, he didn't just abandon a palace. He fled a culture that had forgotten the radical humility at Christianity's core. Gregory XI's death in 1378 should have been a moment of unity for Christendom. Instead, it became the spark that ignited 40 years of chaos. The cardinals, gathered in Rome under pressure from furious mobs demanding an Italian pope, elected Urban VI, a man whose brutal reforms quickly alienated even his supporters. Within months, the same cardinals declared his election invalid, fleeing to Fondi to elect Clement VII instead. But Urban refused to step down, and with that, the unthinkable happened. 2 men claimed to be Christ's true vicar, each with his own court, his own armies, and his own claim to divine authority. The Western Schism had begun, and Avignon's fingerprints were all over it. The parallels to the Babylonian captivity were impossible to ignore. Clement VII, rejected by Rome, did exactly what his predecessors had done. He retreated to Avignon, reviving the papal palace as a rival seat of power. Suddenly, Europe fractured along political lines. France, Scotland, and Castile backed the Avignon Pope, while England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy recognized Urban in Rome. Kings weren't just choosing spiritual allegiances, they were playing chess with faith, using papal support to legitimize wars and taxes. A bishop in Cologne summed up the absurdity, writing that his parishioners now asked, "Which pope should we disobey today?" The schism's deeper damage was to the Church's soul. With rival popes excommunicating each other, sacraments became suspect. Was a baptism performed by an Avignon priest valid in Rome? Could a marriage blessed by one pope be annulled by the other? The confusion trickled down to everyday believers. In Marseille, two priests came to blows over which pope to name during Mass, while in Burgundy, peasants hid their dead rather than risk burial in unconsecrated ground. Theologians warned of a church split like Christ's robe, but power brokers only dug in deeper. Avignon's role in this disaster was no accident. Decades of French dominance had conditioned the cardinals to see the papacy as a political prize, not a sacred trust. The same nepotism that packed the college with French votes now made compromise impossible. When Catherine of Siena begged cardinals to end the schism, her letters went unread. Avignon's bureaucracy, honed over generations, kept the machinery of division running smoothly. Even saints couldn't pierce the castle walls of ambition. The final irony, the schism outlasted Avignon itself. By 1409, Europe had not two but three rival popes after a council in Pisa elected Alexander V. It took another 8 years and the Council of Constance to finally reunite the Church, but the scars remained. Trust in papal infallibility had cracked. Reformers like Jan Hus, emboldened by the chaos, began questioning church authority outright. The schism didn't just divide Christendom, it planted the seeds of the Reformation. And though the Avignon line eventually dissolved, its legacy endured. Proof that when faith becomes a tool of kings, even Peter's keys can't lock the door to disaster. The ink was barely dry on one of Clement VI's papal bulls when his scribe made a curious mistake, or so it seemed. Buried in the flowery Latin praising King Philip VI of France was a nonsensical phrase, "The falcon nests where the willow weeps." To most readers, it was a scribble error. But to the French treasurer who received it, those words triggered a frantic search through his codebook. This wasn't a typo, it was a covert instruction to divert funds from Aquitaine to a secret military project. Among the stacks of pious decrees and theological treatises in Avignon's archives, researchers have uncovered dozens of such coded messages, revealing a shadow diplomacy where popes and monarchs conspired under the cloak of scripture. The ciphers ranged from comically simple to fiendishly complex. Some relied on numerical substitution, every letter replaced by its position in the alphabet, with key numbers shifted by the day's saint. Others used elaborate symbol systems. A dove in the margin might signal approval, while a serpent warned of betrayal. One particularly brazen letter from Edward III of England to Cardinal Talleyrand appeared to discuss liturgical reforms. But when held to candlelight, faint vinegar writing between the lines revealed troop movements and pleas for papal neutrality. The Avignon Chancery didn't just master these tricks, it institutionalized them, employing cryptographers who trained for years in subtle inks and compartmentalized ciphers. Perhaps the most explosive discovery came in 1987, when archivists noticed tiny pinpricks in certain parchments. Under ultraviolet light, these formed patterns matching a cipher wheel found in the belongings of Pope Innocent VI's private secretary. Decoded, they exposed secret agreements with Genos bankers Avignon's gold financing French wars in exchange for silencing investigations into papal nephew's corruption. The real shock wasn't the deals themselves, but their sheer volume. Roughly 1 in 5 spiritual letters contained hidden financial or military clauses, turning the papal mail system into a shadow courier network. Not all secrets stayed buried. When the Florentine spy Antonio degli Orsi infiltrated Avignon's kitchens in 1351, he smuggled out coded grocery lists that actually detailed which cardinals were bribing which French ministers. The list's innocuous phrasing, 20 eggs meaning 20,000 florins, salted pork signaling Swiss mercenaries, showed how mundane documents became vehicles for intrigue. Even saints got involved. Bridget of Sweden's visions, widely distributed as pious tracts, occasionally included veiled critiques of French influence that doubled as rallying cries for reformers. The legacy of this clandestine communication wasn't just political, it eroded trust in the papacy itself. When commoners discovered that indulgences they'd purchased to fund crusades actually bankrolled French castles, revolts erupted from Provence to Aragon. The codes eventually backfired. By Gregory XI's reign, so many factions had cracked the ciphers that a single letter often reached 5 different interpretations. What began as a tool of control became a symbol of duplicity, proving that in Avignon, even the word of God sometimes came with an invisible asterisk. Pope John XXII wasn't just controversial. He nearly tore Christendom apart over a question most believers never thought to ask. Do the dead see God immediately after death, or must they wait until Judgment Day? This wasn't idle theological speculation. When the aging pontiff declared in 1331 that souls couldn't experience the beatific vision until the final resurrection, he ignited a firestorm that threatened to consume the Avignon Papacy. Kings gasped, cardinals whispered of heresy, and Parisian theologians drafted rebuttals before the ink dried on John's sermon. For a man who'd spent decades building Avignon into an administrative powerhouse, this was an unforced error that revealed the peril of mixing absolute power with radical theology. The roots of John's obsession lay in his legalistic mind. A former financial advisor to French kings, he approached heaven's gates like a bureaucrat checking ledgers. If Scripture spoke of a final judgment, he reasoned, then the full glory of God couldn't be parceled out prematurely. His sermons painted a startling interim state, souls basking in Christ's presence but not yet beholding the divine essence, like guests waiting in an antechamber before meeting their host. To modern ears, this might sound like semantics, but in an era where the boundary between heaven and hell dominated daily life, John's words struck like a thunderclap. The backlash was swift and brutal. Charles IV of France, normally a staunch papal ally, sent an angry delegation demanding clarification. At the University of Paris, theology students burned John's effigy, while Dominican friars circulated treatises accusing him of denying the martyrs their heavenly reward. Even more damning was the reaction within Avignon's own walls. Cardinal Jacques Fournier, the future Pope Benedict XII, openly challenged his superior during consistory meetings, asking whether John thought Christ himself had lied to the thief on the cross about being in paradise today. What turned this academic debate into a crisis was John's stubbornness. Rather than backtrack, he doubled down, issuing a formal bull in 1332 that threatened excommunication for anyone teaching the immediate vision doctrine. The papal chancery worked overtime producing pamphlets defending his position, while spies reported Franciscan radicals in Italy using the controversy to denounce Avignon as a nest of heretics. For the first time, the seamless facade of papal infallibility showed cracks not from external attacks but from self-inflicted wounds. The climax came in a dramatic deathbed reversal. As John lay dying in 1334, cardinals pressured him to sign a recantation. Witnesses described his trembling hand pausing before reluctantly scrawling his name, a final act that saved face but couldn't erase the damage. His successor Benedict wasted no time canonizing the opposing view, making the beatific vision dogma in 1336. Yet the scars remained. John's misstep proved even popes couldn't redefine heaven without consequences, exposing how theological whims could shake an institution built on eternal certainties. In trying to systematize the divine, he'd reminded Christendom that some mysteries resist earthly logic, especially when proclaimed from a palace already suspect for its worldly luxuries. Beyond the heresy accusations, John's reign revealed Avignon's deeper tension. Here was a pope who revolutionized church finance with centralized accounting, yet stumbled over celestial bookkeeping. A canon lawyer who codified papal elections, yet couldn't grasp why peasants needed to imagine grandma smiling down from heaven immediately. His story isn't just about theological hubris, it's about what happens when administrative genius meets spiritual overreach. The same intellectual confidence that built Avignon's bureaucratic machine now threatened its spiritual legitimacy, proving that in matters of faith, even the most powerful man in Christendom couldn't dictate how believers envisioned eternity. Salt wasn't just a seasoning in medieval Europe, it was white gold, and the Avignon popes controlled the veins it flowed through. When Clement VI secured exclusive rights to the salt pans of Provence in 1344, he didn't just fill the papal coffers, he weaponized a basic necessity. Overnight, every fish preserved, every cheese aged, every peasant's meal across southern France passed through Avignon's hands. Italian merchants who dominated the trade for centuries found their ships turned away at Marseille, their warehouses suddenly empty. This wasn't commerce, it was economic warfare disguised as pious stewardship, and it revealed how far the papacy would go to bankroll its splendor. The salt monopoly was just the beginning. Papal legates negotiated secret treaties with Catalan pirates to disrupt Genoa's shipping lanes, while French bishops imposed spice tithes on cargoes of pepper and saffron passing through their ports. Venetian ledgers from 1352 show entire galley fleets rerouted to avoid Avignon's web of tariffs, a detour that added weeks to voyages and inflated prices from Constantinople to London. Even humble pilgrims became unwitting revenue streams. Mandatory, safe passage fees were levied on roads to Compostela, with papal agents confiscating the boots of those who couldn't pay. But the real power lay in Avignon's grip on money itself. The papal treasury didn't just collect tithes, it functioned as Europe's first supranational bank. Through a network of Italian financiers like the Alberti and Bardi families, popes could move vast sums across borders without a single coin changing hands. Need to pay mercenaries in Lombardy, a letter of credit from Avignon's chancery would suffice. Want to cripple a rebellious bishop, freeze his diocesan accounts with a stroke of the papal pen. This financial infrastructure gave the Avignon Papacy something no king could match: the ability to wage war without armies, using ledgers instead of lances. The backlash was inevitable. In Florence, wool guilds burned effigies of Clement VI with moneybags for heads. Spanish nobles circulated counterfeit papal bulls to sabotage tax collections. Most audacious was the scheme by Sienese bankers to exploit Avignon's own system. They forged letters authorizing debt forgiveness, sparking chaos when thousands claimed their loans were miraculously pardoned. The papal response was telling. Rather than denounce the fraud as sacrilege, Avignon's lawyers argued it violated temporal contracts, revealing how thoroughly spiritual authority had merged with financial control. What made this economic empire so corrosive wasn't its scale, but its sanctimony. When Pope Innocent VI declared market manipulation a mortal sin, unless practiced by his own tax collectors, even loyal cardinals winced. The bitterest irony, many of the financial innovations designed to enrich Avignon double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, maritime insurance, would later fuel the Renaissance capitalism that made the papacy obsolete as an economic powerhouse. By turning faith into a commodity, the Avignon popes didn't just alienate Christendom, they accidentally laid the groundwork for a world where money, not divine favor, ruled supreme. Step inside the Palais des Papes Chapelle Saint-Martial, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the scent of incense, it's the overwhelming gold. This was no accident. The frescoes commissioned by Clement VI weren't just religious art, they were visual propaganda on an unprecedented scale. Take the famous coronation of the Virgin, a masterstroke of political messaging. While Mary kneels humbly before Christ, the faces of the angelic hosts bear uncanny resemblances to Clement's inner circle, one particularly brazen detail. The Archangel Michael handing Mary her crown wears the exact same jeweled tiara the Pope had worn at his own coronation. The message was clear: divine authority flowed straight from heaven to Avignon's throne. Yet the same brushstrokes that glorified the papacy also betrayed its insecurities. In the Grand Audience Hall, a sprawling Last Judgment fresco placed French cardinals conspicuously close to Christ's right hand, while German and Italian prelates huddled on the edges. Scrutinize the damned below, and you'll spot figures in Florentine and Roman dress tumbling into hell, a not-so-subtle warning to cities resisting Avignon's rule. Even nature conspired to flatter the papacy. Painted vines twisted around columns to form fleurs de lis, the French royal symbol, while the heraldic eagles of the Holy Roman Empire appeared stunted, their wings clipped. Beyond the palace walls, a very different art movement was brewing. Anonymous satirists circulated woodcuts showing popes with wolf snouts devouring flocks of sheep labeled tithes. One particularly vicious example, smuggled into Avignon in 1358, depicted Clement VI holding scales, but instead of balancing justice, one side weighed down with gold while the other held a Bible floating uselessly upward. Italian street artists took it further, painting murals of the whore of Babylon wearing a papal tiara, her robes embroidered with French coats of arms. These weren't just critiques, they were visual revolt, turning the Church's own iconography against itself. The battle even reached manuscript margins. While Avignon's official illuminators painted popes as serene Solomon-like figures, clandestine workshops added subversive doodles like a cardinal's hat transforming into a money bag, or St. Peter weeping as his keys were auctioned to the highest bidder. Some of these defaced books survived because they were hidden inside binding cavities, their heresy preserved like time capsules of dissent. What makes this artistic duel so revealing is how it mirrors the era's spiritual crisis. The same populace that kissed papal rings by day might snicker at anti-clerical cartoons by night. A bishop's tomb in Avignon's cathedral captures this tension perfectly. Its pious inscriptions praise the deceased's virtue, but the sculpted gargoyles at its base leer knowingly, their grotesque faces winking at viewers who understood the real story. Art became the battleground where reverence and rebellion clashed, proving that even in an age of absolute authority, visual whispers could undermine the loudest proclamations of power. Perhaps the most ironic legacy lies in Avignon's surviving fresco fragments. As restoration teams peel back centuries of grime, they've uncovered something the popes never intended: hasty revisions where Italian saints were painted over with French ones, or where original inscriptions about Rome were scrubbed out. These pentimenti artists' corrections tell their own truth. That image control was always a work in progress, and no amount of gold leaf could gild a crumbling legitimacy. The real masterpiece of Avignon's art wars wasn't any single fresco, but the way it exposed how fragile holy authority becomes when it needs to shout its own divinity from every wall. Urban V may have worn the papal tiara, but his heart never left the quiet cloisters of his Benedictine roots. In 1367, this monk turned Pope shocked Christendom by announcing his intention to return the Holy See to Rome, a move that sent French cardinals scrambling like ants from a disturbed nest. Chroniclers described the scene when Urban broke the news, faces flushing crimson under scarlet hats, whispers hissing through the consistory hall like wind through dead leaves. The cardinal's objections came cloaked in concern. The eternal city streets still ran with factional blood, they argued. The plague lingered in its alleys. But the real fear was nakedly political, losing their gilded cages along the Rhone. What made Urban's attempted escape so extraordinary was his reputation. Unlike previous Avignon popes dripping with nepotism, he still wore his monk's hair shirt under silk robes, kept a garden of medicinal herbs, and rose before dawn to pray. When rebuilding Rome's crumbling churches, he insisted on using modest local stone rather than imported marble. This humility became his weapon against the cardinals' resistance. "Shall we fear poverty more than heresy?" he asked pointedly when they protested the cost of relocation. Even Catherine of Siena, normally distrustful of Avignon's hierarchy, wrote him rare words of encouragement, calling his plan a return not just of bodies but of souls. Yet for all his moral authority, Urban underestimated the entrenched system. French cardinals quietly diverted funds meant for Roman reconstruction, while Provençal merchants inflated prices for the papal convoy supplies. Worse still, King Charles V of France, supposedly the papacy's protector, deployed escort troops that suspiciously resembled a surveillance detail. The journey itself became a microcosm of Avignon's contradictions. Crossing the Alps in 1367, Urban's procession included 40 mules laden with liturgical books, and 60 more carrying French wine, tapestries, and a portable organ. Reform, it seemed, could only stretch so far. Rome's disastrous state made the cardinals' predictions self-fulfilling. Without proper housing, curial officials bunked in half-ruined basilicas. Bandits raided supply wagons just outside the city walls. When malaria struck down 3 key reformers in 1370, the French faction pounced, whispering that God himself had condemned the venture. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter: Urban's own homesickness. After just 3 years, he yielded to the cardinals' pressure and returned to Avignon in 1370, dying weeks later in the palace he'd tried to escape. His tomb inscription tellingly omitted any mention of Rome, memorializing him as a lily among thorns, a fitting epitaph for a reformer ensnared by the system he sought to change. Beneath these personal dramas lay a structural rot. Avignon's bureaucracy had grown too vast to transplant hundreds of notaries, tax collectors, and canon lawyers whose livelihoods depended on the status quo. The papal treasury's records from 1366 reveal frantic recalculations. Moving the entire apparatus to Rome would cost over 2 million florins, nearly bankrupting the church. Meanwhile, Italian factions who'd begged for the papacy's return now balked at surrendering local privileges to French-dominated offices. Reform wasn't just fighting cardinals, it was battling an ecosystem of vested interests that had grown over 6 decades. The tragic irony: Urban's brief Roman sojourn had unintended consequences. His restoration of churches like Santa Maria in Trastevere sparked a civic pride that outlasted his retreat. The very cardinals who sabotaged him later recycled his arguments when justifying Gregory XI's permanent return in 1377. Most poignantly, Urban's failed experiment proved that spiritual authority couldn't thrive indefinitely in exile, a lesson his successors would learn too late. As one Roman graffito from the era proclaimed, "The fisherman's net gathers no fish on foreign sand." Gregory XI's decision to abandon Avignon in 1377 wasn't made in a quiet moment of prayer. It was forged in the crucible of screaming mobs, whispered threats, and a crumbling political facade. By the time he boarded the galley that would carry him back to Rome, the papal court had become a pressure cooker. Saint Catherine of Siena's letters, dripping with apocalyptic urgency, warned of divine wrath if the church remained in its gilded exile. Italian cities withheld taxes, their envoys openly mocking Avignon's legitimacy. Even Gregory's own cardinals were divided, some plotting to elect an antipope if he left, others secretly packing their treasures for the journey. This wasn't a triumphant homecoming, it was a retreat under siege, with the very soul of the papacy hanging in the balance. The journey itself was a microcosm of the era's chaos. Gregory's convoy moved like an invading army, flanked by mercenaries hired to fight through rebel-held territories. At one point, his ship nearly capsized off Genoa, a storm so violent that chroniclers claimed it mirrored the tumult in his court. When he finally reached Rome in January 1377, the city was a shadow of its former glory. Wolves reportedly prowled the ruins of the Lateran Palace, while rival noble factions controlled different quarters. Yet the moment Gregory knelt in St. Peter's Basilica, something unexpected happened. Roman citizens wept in the streets not with joy but with raw, desperate relief. Their tears weren't for the Pope, they were for themselves, for a city that had withered without its spiritual heart. But was this return truly a spiritual reckoning or just another political calculation? Gregory's private correspondence suggests cold pragmatism. French cardinals had become a liability, their greed sparking revolts from England to Germany. The treasury, though flush, was hemorrhaging legitimacy, a currency more vital than gold. Even Catherine's fiery prophecies served a purpose. They gave Gregory moral cover to break with Avignon's entrenched interests. The timing was no accident either. With the 100 Years' War draining French resources, Philip V couldn't afford to strong-arm the papacy as his ancestors had. This wasn't repentance, it was realpolitik wrapped in scripture. The aftermath proved just how hollow the victory was. Within months, Gregory found himself trapped between Roman mobs demanding Italian cardinals and French envoys threatening schism. His death in 1378 didn't bring peace, it ignited the Great Schism, with rival popes clawing for power in Avignon and Rome, the tragic irony. Gregory's return, intended to heal the Church's divisions, ultimately exposed them as irreparable. The Avignon experiment hadn't just relocated the papacy, it had shattered the illusion that spiritual authority could ever be disentangled from the dirty chessboard of secular power. The palace on the Rhone stood empty, but its legacy clung like a stubborn shadow, reminding Christendom that some exiles leave wounds no homecoming can heal. Even after the last papal galley disappeared down the Rhone in 1377, Avignon never truly let go of its ghosts. Locals still whisper about the Palais des Papes after dark, how the clink of unseen coins echoes through empty treasuries, how shadowy figures in cardinal red drift through walls where secret ledgers once recorded sins bought and sold. The most persistent legend tells of Pope Clement VI's restless spirit, forever pacing his former bedchamber, clutching a ledger that bleeds ink from its pages. Some say it's punishment for the thousands of souls whose indulgences lined his pockets but never lightened their burdens. Then there's the curse of the broken bridge. The iconic St. Benazet span, immortalized in song, collapsed during a flood in 1668, leaving only 4 arches jutting over the river like a skeletal hand. Folk tales claim it shattered the moment the last honest priest fled Avignon, a divine rebuke for the city's centuries of spiritual commerce. Fishermen swear that on foggy mornings, phantom merchants still haggle on the ruin's edge, their voices rising in sharp barter over the price of salvation. But the darkest stories cluster around the Tower of the Latrines, where prisoners once languished in filth. Visitors report sudden chills near its base, where a macabre graffiti from 1403 still scars the stone. Here lies the truth that never rots. Archaeologists found the shaft packed with burned account books and the skeletons of 3 men, likely debtors who knew too much about Avignon's financial alchemy. Nearby residents avoid the area at night, claiming the air still carries whispers of ledger entries and the metallic tang of old blood. These aren't just campfire tales, they're folk memory crystallizing the era's unresolved sins. The ghostly cardinals eternally counting gold mirror real account books showing missing Templar riches. Clement's phantom ledger echoes the actual library Annotarum registers that tied absolution to payment. Even the bridge's fracture mirrors the broken trust between believers and the institution that monetized their faith. Avignon's specters aren't random, they're metaphors made flesh, reminders that some prices, even paid in gold, never truly settle the debt. Modern paranormal investigators might dismiss these stories as superstition, but historians recognize their power. When a 1392 chronicle describes townsfolk seeing the palace windows ablaze with unholy light on the anniversary of Gregory's departure, it's not just fantasy, it's collective guilt manifesting. The curses clinging to Avignon stones aren't supernatural. They're the afterlife of corruption, the whispers of a world that once believed God's favor could be bought, then realized too late the receipt was written in disappearing ink. For centuries, the Vatican's sealed archives guarded Avignon's darkest secrets until a stunning decision in 2019 cracked open the vault. When Pope Francis granted historians limited access to previously restricted 14th century documents, the revelations upended long-held assumptions about the papacy's French exile. Among the most explosive finds, a cache of letters between Cardinal Guillaume de Court and King Philip VI, proving the French crown routinely vetted papal appointments before they were announced. One memorandum from 1338 bluntly states, "The bishopric of Toulouse will go to our cousin. As agreed, let the consistory vote proceed for appearance's sake." This wasn't just influence, it was choreographed theater with Avignon's cardinals dancing to Paris' tune. The archives also exposed financial machineries more elaborate than anyone suspected. Ledgers marked secretum detailed a shadow accounting system where Templar gold officially donated to the Hospitallers was secretly funneled through Avignon's mint and stamped with papal insignia. Forensic ink analysis revealed entries altered by multiple hands, suggesting generations of clerics maintained this fiscal sleight of hand. Most damning was a 1345 inventory listing 3 chests of Asian silks and spices delivered to Clement VI's nephew, their value matching exactly the missing tithes from that year's Venetian trade levy. The paper trail didn't just confirm corruption, it proved the entire system was designed to be untraceable. Yet for every answered question, the archives birthed new mysteries. A heavily redacted dossier labeled Captivitas Babylonus contained eerie prophecies about the papacy's return to Rome, including precise descriptions of Gregory XI's fatal illness years before it occurred. Were these genuine mystical visions or political forgeries meant to manipulate decisions? Even more unsettling were the gaps. Entire years of financial records vanished, their absence marked by placeholder pages stating only "Hic nihil isti," here lies nothing. Archivists suspect these missing folios may hold keys to the Templar treasure's final resting place, or perhaps evidence of that most taboo accusation, that certain Avignon popes privately doubted their own legitimacy. The Vatican's selective disclosures have only fueled speculation. Why release documents about financial crimes but withhold correspondence concerning the alleged poisoning of Benedict XI? Why showcase French interference yet keep sealed the testimonies about Cardinal Orsini's suspicious death? Historians like Dr. Maria Battista argue these curated revelations are strategic, a way for the Church to acknowledge past sins on its own terms while retaining control over narratives that might still threaten its authority. The greatest power, after all, lies not in hiding the truth, but in deciding which truths get told. What lingers in those locked cabinets may rewrite history. Rumors persist of a cipher-laden manuscript called Liber Obsidus, the Book of Hostages, allegedly containing confessions from Avignon spies embedded in royal courts across Europe. Others whisper of schematics for hidden tunnels beneath the papal palace, where heretical texts or plundered relics might still lie. Until those last doors open, the full story of Avignon remains half-told, its darkest chapters still guarded by the very institution that once called it home. The archives have given us pieces of the puzzle, but the picture they form depends entirely on who holds the missing fragments. The question of whether Avignon was a betrayal of spiritual ideals or a necessary survival tactic still divides historians today. On one side, scholars like Joseph Strayer argue the move was pure pragmatism, a temporary retreat to stabilize a papacy under siege. Rome in the early 1400s was a battleground, its streets running with blood from noble feuds. The Lateran Palace had literally crumbled after a fire, while rival factions like the Orsini and Colonna families turned St. Peter's into a fortified camp. In this light, Avignon wasn't surrender, it was strategic regrouping. The popes could administer Christendom from a secure base, reforming finances and diplomacy without daggers at their throats. Supporters point to concrete achievements, standardized canon law, centralized record-keeping, even the first attempts at church-sponsored universities. But critics fire back with Bernard Guillaume's scorching assessment that Avignon traded short-term safety for long-term disaster. By nesting in French territory, the papacy became a geopolitical pawn. Every cardinal appointed, every bull issued carried the whiff of Parisian interference. The infamous Gallican liberties, special privileges granting French kings control over local clergy, weren't just concessions, they were shackles disguised as favors. Even Avignon's architectural splendor worked against it. When Bridget of Sweden described the papal palace as a fortress of pride, she captured the optics, a church preaching humility while dwelling in gilded excess. The financial argument cuts both ways. Apologists highlight how Avignon's tax systems funded hospitals and famine relief across Europe. Yet records from Siena show desperate peasants selling their children to pay papal tithes, a grotesque irony for an institution claiming moral authority. The defense crumbles further when examining the Papacy banking scandal, where Clement VI's treasurer embezzled 200,000 florins to fund his nephew's mercenary army. This wasn't stewardship, it was piracy with a crucifix. Perhaps the most nuanced perspective comes from historian Renate Blumenfeld-Kaczynski, who frames Avignon as a tragic compromise. The papacy preserved its administrative body but sacrificed its soul. Like a tree transplanted to richer soil, it grew taller, but its roots never gripped as deeply. The schism that followed wasn't just political fallout, it was the inevitable rupture when spiritual authority becomes inseparable from temporal power. Even Gregory XI's return to Rome couldn't stitch Christendom back together. The seam held for a generation, then split wide open. Modern parallels haunt these debates. When a Vatican spokesperson recently likened Avignon to temporary corporate relocation during restructuring, it sparked outrage, proof the wounds haven't fully healed. Perhaps the final judgment lies not in ledgers or treaties, but in art, the haunting Avignon Pieta, where Mary cradles a Christ figure with the face of Pope Urban V. The message is unmistakable. Whether necessity or betrayal, the Avignon Papacy ultimately crucified something sacred, the fragile faith that God's representatives should transcend the muck of kings. The Avignon Papacy wasn't just a relocation, it was a masterclass in how power operates behind velvet curtains. Beneath the grand processions and Latin decrees, three ruthless agendas shaped those 68 years: gold, crowns, and bloodlines. Financially, the popes transformed spiritual authority into a revenue machine, taxing sacraments, selling bishoprics, and centralizing wealth with a sophistication that would make modern bankers envious. Politically, they danced on a knife's edge, pretending to balance French kings against European rivals while secretly becoming Paris's most powerful weapon. And dynastically, they turned the church into a family enterprise, stacking the College of Cardinals with nephews and cousins until the line between holy office and hereditary right blurred beyond recognition. Consider the irony. These were men who preached the poverty of Christ while dining on peacocks served by servants in livery. They condemned usury yet built an empire on interest-bearing tithes. They claimed to shepherd souls but measured their flocks in ledger entries. The Palais des Papes, with its frescoed halls and counting rooms side by side, became the perfect metaphor, a place where prayer books shared shelves with loan agreements, and the clink of coins echoed louder than Gregorian chant. Yet to dismiss Avignon as mere corruption misses the darker brilliance of its survival strategy. In a Europe fracturing into nation-states, the papacy faced an existential threat: become a French puppet or risk irrelevance. By embedding itself in Provençal soil, it bought time to reinvent itself, centralizing administration, streamlining diplomacy, and creating the first truly international bureaucracy. The cost: moral authority traded for institutional longevity. The result: a church that outlived its rivals but at the price of its soul. So was this era a cautionary tale or a case study in realpolitik? Did the Avignon popes corrupt the faith to save it, or simply lose themselves in the labyrinth of power? Perhaps the answer lies in the contradictions they left behind: a broken bridge leading nowhere, a treasury overflowing with empty promises, and a palace whose walls still whisper the uncomfortable truth that when holiness shares a bed with power, it's always the divine that wakes up compromised. The real hidden agenda may have been the one they couldn't admit, even to themselves: that in choosing to rule like kings, they'd forgotten how to serve as shepherds.